This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Evelyn Mercer had always been a woman who radiated quiet grace. At 85 years old, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect, even as the years weighed on her bones. Her house sat at the end of a tranquil street in Clearwater, a sleepy town where life moved slowly and neighbors rarely exchanged more than polite greetings. It was a place where everyone knew of each other but knew little of anyone's true heart. Evelyn had lived in Clearwater for over 5 decades, raising her children and building a life alongside her late husband Albert, a man she had loved deeply, but who had passed away many years ago. In her youth, Evelyn had been known for her striking beauty, vibrant auburn hair that seemed to glow in the sunlight, a graceful figure that turned heads and eyes so sharp they could cut through any pretense. Time had softened those features, but even at her advanced age, she retained a kind of elegance that drew people to her. Her once auburn hair was now a delicate shade of silver, always styled neatly into a soft bun or loose waves. Her face, lined with the wrinkles of a life well lived, still held the same spark that had defined her in her younger years. But behind that elegance, there was a loneliness that few could see. Evelyn had spent much of her later years in quiet solitude. Her children, grown and successful, lived far away, caught up in the rhythms of their own lives. They called her every few weeks, visited on holidays, but the long stretches of time in between were marked by an unshakable quiet. The house, once filled with the laughter of children and the warm presence of family, had become a hollow echo of the life she once knew. After Albert's death, Evelyn had learned to cope with her solitude, filling her days with small tasks, reading books, tending to her garden, and attending the occasional social event at the local community center. But as the years passed, the weight of isolation grew heavier. The people of Clearwater respected Evelyn, but she had never been someone to share her innermost thoughts with others. She had always carried her burdens quietly, never wanting to burden anyone with her sadness. Her outward life seemed peaceful, but the silence within her home felt like a constant reminder of what she had lost. She had once had love, passion, and companionship, but now all that remained were memories. Her friends at the community center were kind, but most of them were as lost in their own worlds as she was. The bridge games and afternoon teas offered momentary distractions, but they couldn't fill the emptiness. Everything changed the day she met Victor Hall, a retired 65-year-old novelist who had recently moved to Clearwater. Victor was a man of intellect, tall and lean, with a head of graying hair and a pair of spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. He had spent most of his life in the city, immersed in the literary world, but after his career had wound down, he sought the quiet refuge of a small town to finish his final book. He and Evelyn met at the local library, where both were regular patrons. Their shared love of books became the foundation of a friendship that quickly deepened into something more. Victor was immediately drawn to Evelyn's sharp mind, her wit, and the stories she told of her past. He found in her an unexpected muse, someone who reminded him that life still held mysteries and beauty, even in its later years. For Evelyn, Victor represented a connection she hadn't felt in decades. Their conversations were rich, full of laughter and thoughtful exchanges, and for the first time in a long while she felt intellectually stimulated. They spent hours discussing books, art, and the meaning of life. Victor, though younger than Evelyn, was captivated by her wisdom, her grace, and the quiet strength she carried with her. Their relationship began innocently, with long walks through Clearwater's shaded parks and shared evenings in front of the fire, but soon it grew into something deeper. It was a romance of the mind as much as of the heart, a bond that made Evelyn feel alive in a way she hadn't since Albert's passing. Around the same time, Oscar Jenkins entered Evelyn's life. Oscar was a 58-year-old handyman who had lived in Clearwater for most of his life. Unlike Victor, who was refined and introspective, Oscar was rugged and straightforward, a man of action rather than words. He had been hired by Evelyn to fix a few things around her house, repair a leaky roof, patch up a broken window, and through those small acts of service, their connection blossomed. Oscar was captivated by Evelyn's resilience, her determination to keep her home in order despite her age, and her quiet, understated beauty. He admired her from the beginning, but as he spent more time with her, working around the house and exchanging light conversation, his feelings deepened. For Evelyn, Oscar offered something different from Victor's intellectual companionship. He brought warmth, a physical presence that reminded her of what it felt like to be cared for in a more practical, intimate way. Oscar would stay after finishing his work, sharing simple meals with Evelyn in her cozy kitchen, and over time their relationship grew closer. He wasn't as refined or eloquent as Victor, but there was something comforting in his straightforward nature. He looked at her with admiration and desire, and while Evelyn hadn't expected to feel that kind of affection again at her age, she found herself drawn to him. Oscar made Evelyn feel desirable in a way that surprised her. He touched her hand with gentle care, looked at her with eyes that saw beyond her wrinkles, and made her laugh with his stories of life as a handyman in a town where everyone knew everyone. There was a simplicity in their relationship that contrasted with the deep intellectual connection she shared with Victor, but Evelyn reveled in the balance it brought to her life. She was not just a widow, a mother, or an elderly woman. She was still capable of passion, of being wanted, of feeling alive in her body. Then there was Samuel Ross, a 42-year-old cafe owner who had moved to Clearwater to escape the chaos of the city. Samuel was the youngest of the three men, and his attraction to Evelyn surprised even him. He had always been drawn to older women, finding their wisdom and experience alluring, but there was something about Evelyn that captivated him beyond the usual admiration. She carried herself with a calm confidence that he found irresistible, and over time he began to visit her more frequently. It started with small gestures, bringing her fresh pastries from his cafe, offering to help her with groceries, but soon, Samuel found himself lingering in her company longer and longer. Samuel admired Evelyn's grace and the way she seemed untroubled by the small concerns that plagued younger people. He found peace in her presence, and though there was a significant age difference between them, he was drawn to her, not just out of physical attraction, but out of a deep respect for the life she had lived. For Evelyn, Samuel represented a kind of youthful energy she hadn't felt in a long time. His admiration made her feel vibrant, almost as if time had slowed down when they were together. What began as innocent companionship with each of these men soon blossomed into something far more complex. Each man offered Evelyn something different, and each brought out a part of her that had long been dormant. With Victor, she was the intellectual equal, sharing deep thoughts and reflecting on life's meaning. With Oscar, she was desired, cared for, and made to feel like a woman who still had physical beauty. With Samuel, she felt young again, admired not only for her wisdom but for the vibrant spirit that still lived within her. The relationships gave Evelyn a new purpose, a reason to wake up each morning with anticipation. She had thought her romantic days were long behind her, but now, at 85, she found herself caught up in a whirlwind of affection and attention that made her feel more alive than she had in years. However, beneath the surface of these relationships, tension was brewing. The men, though each unaware of the others at first, began to sense that Evelyn's attentions were divided. What had once been an exhilarating escape from loneliness was now becoming a dangerous game, and Evelyn, despite her wisdom, had no idea how far things would spiral out of control. As Evelyn Mercer's relationships with Victor, Oscar, and Samuel deepened, the delicate balance she had once managed so effortlessly began to shift. What started as three separate and exhilarating romances slowly morphed into a complicated web of emotional tension, each man pulling at her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thrill of being desired by three men, each offering her something unique, was now clouded by their growing expectations, jealousy, and possessiveness. Evelyn found herself caught between them, her once quiet life becoming a tangle of conflicting emotions and escalating demands. Victor, the retired novelist, was the first to grow uneasy. His connection with Evelyn had always been intellectual, rooted in their shared love of literature and philosophy. He admired her wisdom and found solace in their conversations, but as their relationship evolved, Victor's attachment deepened into something more possessive. At 65, he was not a man used to sharing his affections. For him, Evelyn was more than just a lover. She was his muse, the person who reignited his passion for writing and for life itself. He became increasingly dependent on her for emotional support, and what had once been a mutual exchange of ideas slowly turned into an unspoken demand for her constant attention. Victor began writing her letters, long, thoughtful missives filled with reflections on their relationship and his feelings for her. He poured his soul into these letters, expecting Evelyn to respond in kind. But as she grew more entangled with Oscar and Samuel, her replies became less frequent, and Victor noticed. The emotional distance troubled him. He had never been an overtly jealous man, but his intellectual pride made it difficult for him to accept that Evelyn's attentions might be elsewhere. He began to ask subtle, probing questions, trying to gauge where her heart truly lay. Each time they met, Victor sought reassurance, though he disguised his insecurity behind their usual discussions of literature and art. For Evelyn, the weight of Victor's growing need became overwhelming. She still valued their connection, but his constant demands for her intellectual and emotional presence began to drain her. She found herself making excuses to avoid his frequent invitations to meet, but Victor's sharp mind picked up on the shift. He started pressing her for answers, his once gentle inquiries turning into pointed remarks about her absences and distracted demeanor. Victor's letters became more intense, filled with veiled accusations and subtle expressions of frustration. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but his increasing possessiveness only pushed Evelyn further away. Meanwhile, Oscar's behavior also began to change. The 58-year-old handyman had always been straightforward and practical, never one for grand declarations or flowery words. His relationship with Evelyn was built on a foundation of physical affection and mutual care. Oscar loved being the one who could fix things for her, both around the house and in her life. He enjoyed their quiet dinners, the way she smiled at him when he arrived to repair a broken fence or fix a leaky roof. But as their relationship deepened, Oscar started to want more. His affection for Evelyn turned into a need for exclusivity, a desire to be the only man in her life. Oscar wasn't as intellectually driven as Victor, but he was fiercely protective of Evelyn. He began showing up at her house unannounced, making excuses to check on her or see if she needed anything at first. Evelyn found it sweet, a sign that he cared for her deeply. But soon, Oscar's frequent visits became intrusive. He started arriving at odd hours, lingering longer than necessary, and asking questions that hinted at his growing suspicion. He wanted to know where she had been, why she hadn't answered his last call, or why she seemed distant when they were together. Oscar's possessiveness was different from Victor's. It wasn't subtle or intellectual, it was raw and emotional. He didn't know how to express his feelings in words, so he used actions, showing up, fixing things, trying to be present in her life as much as possible. But Evelyn began to feel suffocated by his constant presence. She cherished the physical affection Oscar provided, but she also needed space. The more she tried to pull back, the more Oscar pushed forward. He couldn't understand why she seemed to be slipping away from him, and his frustration turned into thinly veiled anger. One evening, after she had canceled a planned dinner with Oscar, he arrived at her doorstep without warning. He stood there, a bouquet of flowers in hand, looking at her with a mixture of hurt and suspicion. Evelyn, taken aback by his unexpected visit, tried to explain that she needed time for herself. But Oscar wasn't satisfied. His questions grew sharper, and Evelyn could see the possessiveness in his eyes. He didn't accuse her directly, but the implication was clear. Oscar believed she was seeing someone else, and the thought was eating away at him. While Evelyn grappled with the emotional weight of Victor's and Oscar's increasing demands, Samuel, the youngest of the three, was quietly spiraling into his own form of obsession. At 42, Samuel had always been more reserved than the other two men, his admiration for Evelyn tempered by a deep respect for her independence. He loved her stories of the past, the wisdom she imparted during their long conversations over coffee, and the way she seemed to glow with a vitality that belied her years. For Samuel, Evelyn represented something pure and timeless, a woman whose spirit transcended age. But Samuel's quiet infatuation began to grow into something deeper, something darker. He found himself thinking about her constantly, replaying their conversations in his mind, wondering what she was doing when they weren't together. He started leaving her small gifts, flowers, pastries from his cafe, handwritten notes expressing his admiration. At first, Evelyn was touched by his gestures, but as Samuel's attentions became more frequent, she began to sense a growing intensity in his behavior. Samuel started dropping by her house more often, usually under the guise of bringing her something from his cafe or checking in on her. Unlike Oscar, who was direct in his questions, Samuel's approach was more subtle. He never asked where she had been or who she had been with, but Evelyn could feel the unspoken questions in the way he looked at her. He wanted to be more than just a casual companion, he wanted to be the center of her world. The admiration that had once made her feel young and vibrant now began to feel like a burden. As Samuel's feelings deepened, he grew more anxious about the possibility that Evelyn might not feel the same way. He started to doubt whether she truly cared for him or if he was simply another distraction in her life. His once gentle messages turned into longer, more emotional confessions of love. He wrote about how much she meant to him, how he couldn't imagine his life without her, and how he longed for the day when they could be together without any barriers. These confessions, which had once made Evelyn smile, now filled her with a sense of dread. Samuel's attachment was becoming too intense, too consuming. Evelyn found herself overwhelmed by the emotional strain of managing three men who were each demanding more of her than she could give. Victor's possessiveness, Oscar's jealousy, and Samuel's quiet obsession were pulling her in different directions, leaving her no room to breathe. What had once been an exhilarating escape from loneliness was now a heavy burden that threatened to crush her. Each man wanted her for himself, and the walls she had carefully built between her relationships were beginning to collapse. The emotional toll on Evelyn was palpable. She felt trapped in a web of her own making, unable to disentangle herself without causing pain to the men she had grown to care for in different ways. She had wanted to feel alive again, to experience passion and affection, but now that passion had turned into a source of anxiety and fear. Evelyn knew that something had to give, but she had no idea how to unravel the mess she had created without hurting the people who had come to mean so much to her. The tension between the men, though they were still unaware of each other's existence, was building to a breaking point. Each sensed that Evelyn's attention was divided, and each was growing more desperate to claim her for himself. Victor, Oscar, and Samuel were no longer satisfied with the fragments of her time and affection. They wanted all of her. And Evelyn, caught in the middle, could feel the storm gathering, knowing that the delicate balance she had maintained was about to shatter in ways she could no longer control. As the emotional strain mounted, Evelyn Mercer's once carefully hidden affairs began to show signs of unraveling. The balance she had maintained between the three men, Victor, Oscar, and Samuel, was slipping from her grasp, and the cracks in her secret life were becoming impossible to ignore. What had once been a thrilling dance between desire and companionship was now a precarious situation spiraling out of control. Victor, the retired novelist who had once admired Evelyn for her intellect and grace, was the first to notice the change. Their deep conversations, once a source of joy for them both, had grown strained. Evelyn's responses to his letters became infrequent and vague, her once thoughtful replies reduced to polite but hollow phrases. Victor's sharp mind quickly picked up on the emotional distance she was putting between them. He had always prided himself on being perceptive, and now he could sense that something was amiss. Victor began visiting Evelyn more often, under the pretense of discussing literature or seeking her advice on his writing. But beneath these visits was a growing need for reassurance. He suspected that she was seeing someone else, though he couldn't prove it. His probing questions became more pointed, his once subtle inquiries now thinly veiled attempts to get to the truth. Evelyn, caught in the web of her own making, deflected his suspicions with charm, but each encounter left her feeling more trapped. The tension between them was palpable, and Victor's quiet jealousy, though still restrained, was beginning to bubble to the surface. Oscar, the rugged handyman who had always been more direct in his affections, was less subtle in his approach. His possessiveness, which had been simmering for weeks, now flared into outright suspicion. He started showing up at Evelyn's house unannounced, using any excuse to check on her. Whether it was to fix a leaky faucet or bring her some fresh vegetables from his garden, Oscar found reasons to be there, watching for signs of someone else in her life. He noticed small things: the way she hurried to answer the phone when he arrived, the way she seemed flustered at his unexpected visits. Oscar's frustration grew each time Evelyn canceled a meeting or seemed distracted during their time together. He didn't confront her directly at first, but his questions became more invasive, and his demeanor more guarded. He began arriving earlier than expected, hoping to catch her in the act of hiding something, or worse, someone. The warm affection that had once defined their relationship was replaced by a simmering tension, and Evelyn could feel his eyes on her, searching for the truth she desperately tried to conceal. She had always enjoyed Oscar's strong, protective nature, but now that protectiveness felt stifling, as if he were trying to control her every move. Meanwhile, Samuel, the youngest of the three, was quietly becoming more possessive in his own way. Unlike Victor and Oscar, Samuel's obsession was less overt, but no less intense. His messages to Evelyn, once filled with admiration and light-hearted affection, grew more emotional, bordering on desperate. He wrote to her daily, expressing how much he missed her, how her absence made his days feel empty. His gifts, which had once been thoughtful gestures, became a constant stream of attention, a way to remind her of his presence, even when they weren't together. Samuel started lingering outside her house longer after their meetings, hoping for another glimpse of her, hoping she might invite him in. He would drive by her home late at night, just to see if the lights were on, his heart racing with both excitement and fear that she might be entertaining someone else. His quiet devotion had turned into an all-consuming obsession, though he was careful not to let it show too much when they were together. But Evelyn could sense the shift in him. His eyes lingered on her a little too long, his words were tinged with unspoken need, and his behavior was becoming more erratic. As the demands from each man grew, Evelyn's ability to juggle them faltered. There were close calls, Victor arriving at her house minutes after Samuel had left, Oscar's truck pulling into the driveway just as she was saying goodbye to Victor, or Samuel catching a glimpse of Oscar's toolbox by the door. Each near miss sent a wave of panic through her, the delicate web of secrecy she had woven becoming increasingly fragile. Evelyn was no longer in control of the situation. What had once been exhilarating was now exhausting, as she found herself constantly on edge, trying to keep her three lives from colliding. The strain began to show in her own health. The sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, and the emotional toll of managing three demanding relationships took a toll on her body. She became more withdrawn, her once sharp mind clouded with worry. She missed appointments, forgot promises she had made, and found herself making excuses to avoid seeing any of the men. But the more she pulled away, the more they pushed for answers. Victor, ever the intellectual, tried to reason with her, but his patience was wearing thin. He pressed her for explanations, his carefully crafted words now carrying an edge of accusation. Oscar, more direct, demanded to know what was going on, his frustration boiling over into anger as he confronted her about her absences and evasiveness. And Samuel, though still outwardly calm, began to unravel emotionally, his once composed demeanor slipping as he grew increasingly desperate for her attention. Evelyn could feel the weight of their expectations crushing her. The lies she had told to keep the peace were becoming harder to maintain, and the walls she had built to separate her relationships were crumbling. Each man wanted more from her, more time, more commitment, more of her life, and she could no longer give them what they demanded without betraying the others. The emotional toll was suffocating, and Evelyn found herself retreating into the quiet corners of her home, trying to find solace in the very solitude she had once sought to escape. But even in the sanctuary of her home, there was no peace. The phone rang incessantly, each call from one of the men demanding an answer, a promise, or an explanation. Her inbox filled with messages, Victor's letters, Oscar's questions, Samuel's confessions, all piling up, a constant reminder that the life she had built was falling apart. Evelyn could no longer keep up the charade, but she didn't know how to escape it without hurting them all. The cracks in her secret life had become too deep to ignore. The pressure from each man was unbearable, and Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. She had played a dangerous game, believing she could manage the affections of three men without consequence. But now, with each passing day, the consequences of her choices were becoming clearer, and the fallout was inevitable. Evelyn's world, once filled with passion and excitement, was now suffocating under the weight of jealousy, possessiveness, and the lies she had told to keep the peace. She could feel the storm brewing, the tensions between the men escalating, even though they remained unaware of each other. But for how much longer? Evelyn knew she was running out of time, and the carefully constructed life she had built was about to come crashing down, with devastating consequences. The night of the climactic confrontation began in a way that felt strangely ordinary to Evelyn. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves rustling as they danced across her front yard, and the sky had turned a deep, bruised shade of purple as evening fell over Clearwater. Inside her quiet house, Evelyn tried to ignore the tension that had been building for weeks, a tension she could feel tightening around her like a noose. She had planned to spend the night alone, away from the emotional demands of Victor, Oscar, and Samuel, but fate had other plans. Victor had been the first to reach out earlier that day, asking to see her. His messages were filled with urgency, a tone she couldn't easily dismiss. He had grown increasingly agitated over the past few weeks, and Evelyn knew that his patience was wearing thin. She had delayed their meeting long enough, and now he was insisting on seeing her tonight. Reluctantly, she agreed, knowing that she couldn't keep avoiding him without raising more suspicion. She had always valued their intellectual connection, but lately their conversations had become a battleground of accusations and veiled frustrations. Victor arrived just after dusk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an air of tension. As he stepped through the door, Evelyn noticed how tightly he clutched the leather-bound notebook he always carried, a sure sign that he was feeling unsettled. His eyes, once warm and filled with admiration, now flickered with something darker: anxiety, perhaps even anger. He didn't speak immediately, instead pacing the living room as if searching for the right words. Before Victor could fully express whatever was on his mind, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway pierced the quiet of the evening. Evelyn's heart sank. She hadn't expected anyone else, but as she glanced out the window, she saw Oscar's truck pulling up to the house. Her pulse quickened with dread. Oscar hadn't called, hadn't given any indication that he would be coming by tonight. But there he was, stepping out of his truck with the same determined look she had grown to fear in recent weeks. He had been suspicious for a while now, constantly questioning her about where she had been, why she had canceled their last few meetings, and why she seemed distant. Evelyn's mind raced as she tried to come up with a way to defuse the situation. But before she could react, Oscar was already knocking on the door. Victor, sensing that something was off, stopped pacing and shot her a questioning look. Evelyn opened the door slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension between the two men was immediate, filling the space between them like an invisible wall. Oscar stepped into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto Victor. It didn't take long for him to piece together what was happening. He didn't need to ask why another man was in Evelyn's house, his face said it all. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations, and Evelyn, standing between them, felt utterly powerless. The confrontation began quietly at first, with Oscar's voice low and controlled, though every word was laced with tension. He asked Evelyn why Victor was there, but his question wasn't directed at her, it was meant for Victor. The novelist, always measured, responded calmly, but his words only seemed to inflame Oscar's growing anger. He accused Victor of overstepping, of being an intruder in something that wasn't his business. The calm facade that Victor had maintained began to crack, and soon the two men were exchanging sharp words, their voices rising with each sentence. Evelyn tried to step in, to calm them down, but her attempts were drowned out by their escalating argument. Victor, his pride wounded, refused to back down. He insisted that his relationship with Evelyn was something neither Oscar nor anyone else had the right to question. Oscar, fueled by weeks of pent-up jealousy, wasn't having it. He took a step closer to Victor, his posture threatening, and Evelyn's stomach churned with fear. She had never seen Oscar like this. His usual calm, practical nature had been replaced by a barely controlled fury. Just as the tension seemed ready to erupt into violence, there was another knock at the door. Evelyn froze. She already knew who it was before she even glanced out the window. Samuel. Of all the nights for him to come by, this was the worst possible time. She hadn't heard from him earlier in the day, but he often dropped by unannounced, bringing her pastries or coffee from his cafe. Now, with Oscar and Victor already at each other's throats, Samuel's arrival was like adding fuel to an already roaring fire. Evelyn opened the door, her hands shaking, and there stood Samuel, holding a small box of pastries, and looking as if he hadn't sensed the storm brewing inside. His face lit up when he saw her, but that light quickly faded when he noticed the tension in the room. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes darting between Victor and Oscar, trying to make sense of what was happening. Evelyn didn't need to explain. The look of betrayal that flashed across Samuel's face told her that he understood everything in an instant. Now all three men were standing in her living room, the air thick with jealousy, hurt, and confusion. The confrontation that followed was inevitable. Words flew sharp, angry, cutting words that exposed all the secrets Evelyn had tried so hard to keep. Oscar, his voice rising to a shout, demanded to know how long this had been going on, accusing her of playing them all for fools. Victor, calmer but no less furious, questioned how Evelyn could let things get so out of control. Samuel, the quietest of the three, stood in stunned silence, his face pale as the reality of her multiple relationships set in. Evelyn, caught in the middle of the chaos, tried to defend herself, but her words were lost in the noise. The men weren't listening to her anymore, they were too consumed by their own emotions. Oscar, unable to hold back any longer, lunged at Victor, shoving him back against the bookshelf. The two men collided, their argument turning physical as they struggled with one another. Books tumbled to the floor, and the noise of their scuffle filled the room. Samuel, though still in shock, rushed forward to intervene, trying to pull Oscar away from Victor, but in the confusion he was shoved aside. Evelyn screamed for them to stop, but it was too late. The scene had already spiraled out of control. In the chaos, Oscar grabbed a heavy ceramic lamp from the side table and swung it at Victor, striking him across the head. Victor staggered, blood streaming down his face as he collapsed to the floor. Samuel, in a panic, tried to check on him, but Oscar, blinded by rage, wasn't finished. He turned on Samuel, pushing him back against the wall, shouting incoherent accusations about betrayal. Evelyn, trembling with fear, rushed toward them, trying to intervene, but in the confusion, she was shoved hard to the ground. Her frail body crumpled beneath the force of the fall, and she lay still, her vision blurring as pain shot through her. The men, caught up in their violent outburst, didn't notice at first. But when Samuel turned and saw her lying motionless on the floor, the reality of what had happened finally hit him. The room fell silent. The only sound the ragged breathing of the men and the distant echo of the night outside. Samuel knelt beside Evelyn, his hands shaking as he tried to rouse her, but her eyes were already closed. The life that had once filled her with such vibrancy was gone. The men stood there, frozen in shock, their anger dissipating in an instant as the full weight of what had happened settled over them. Evelyn Mercer, the woman they had all loved in their own way, was dead, and nothing could undo the tragedy that had unfolded in her quiet home. The storm of emotions, jealousy, and possessiveness that had brewed for so long had finally broken, leaving only devastation in its wake. The moment Evelyn Mercer's body hit the floor, the energy in the room shifted from chaos to a stunned silence. Oscar, Victor, and Samuel stood frozen, their breaths heavy from the scuffle. But the sight of Evelyn lying motionless at their feet drained the adrenaline from their veins. For a brief, agonizing second, none of them moved. The reality of what had just happened slowly dawned on them, transforming their anger into shock. Samuel was the first to react. Dropping to his knees beside Evelyn, he gently shook her shoulder, his hands trembling as he called her name. There was no response. Her frail body lay still, her face pale, and her breathing had ceased. His hands moved to her wrist, searching for a pulse, but he found none. The horror of the moment paralyzed him. He looked up at Oscar, whose face had gone ashen. The blood still trickling from Victor's forehead seemed insignificant now compared to the stillness of the woman they had all loved. Oscar stood back, eyes wide, his breath shallow as the weight of what had just occurred hit him. He had been angry, furious even, but he had never intended for things to escalate like this. The image of Evelyn on the ground, lifeless, burned into his mind. Guilt and disbelief washed over him in waves. He took a step forward, reaching out as if to fix what had already been broken, but there was nothing he could do. Victor, clutching his bleeding head, leaned against the wall, his face a mask of pain and confusion. He hadn't seen how it happened one moment. The argument had raged, and the next, Evelyn had fallen, her body crumpled like a fragile doll. His pride, his anger, all of it seemed meaningless now in the face of her death. There were no words left to speak. The once cozy living room, where Evelyn had entertained each of them in private moments, now felt cold and oppressive. The three men, once vying for her attention, stood helpless, united by their collective guilt. The life that had once drawn them together was gone, leaving only devastation in its wake. Samuel, still kneeling beside Evelyn, broke the silence. He whispered her name again, tears filling his eyes as the full weight of her death sank in. But Evelyn remained still, her heart no longer beating, her breath no longer warming the air. The woman who had sparked so much passion, desire, and jealousy was now gone, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of the lives she had touched. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded inside the house. But for Oscar, Victor, and Samuel, time had stopped. Evelyn Mercer was dead, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following Evelyn's death, the quiet town of Clearwater was shaken to its core. What had once seemed like a peaceful elderly woman's life had been revealed as a tangled web of secret affairs and devastating betrayal. The police arrived quickly after the 911 call from a neighbor who had heard the commotion. Oscar, Victor, and Samuel, each in a state of shock, were taken into custody, though none of them could fully explain what had happened that night. The truth, now coming to light, was messier than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Evelyn's death uncovered the details of her relationships with the three men. Victor's intellectual romance, Oscar's physical connection, and Samuel's emotional devotion, what had once been her carefully guarded secret life, was now exposed for all to see. The police pieced together a story of jealousy and escalating tension, fueled by the possessiveness of the men and the impossibility of Evelyn maintaining control over them all. Each man was questioned separately, and though their stories differed in the details, the central truth was clear. Evelyn's death had not been premeditated. It was the tragic result of a confrontation spiraling out of control, a culmination of weeks of rising jealousy, suspicion, and emotional strain. Oscar admitted to striking Victor in the heat of the moment, but none of them could say for certain who had pushed Evelyn during the struggle. What had started as an argument fueled by hurt pride and competing affections had ended in an accidental death that none of them had intended. The town was left reeling from the scandal. Neighbors who had known Evelyn as a kind, elderly woman were shocked to learn of her relationships with three much younger men. The once quiet house at the end of the street became a symbol of the tragedy, drawing curious onlookers and fueling gossip. The media latched onto the story, painting Evelyn as a femme fatale who had toyed with the affections of her lovers until it led to disaster. But those who truly knew her, or thought they did, struggled to reconcile the woman they loved with the one who had kept such a complex and secret life. Oscar Victor and Samuel faced public scrutiny and legal consequences. Though Evelyn's death was ruled accidental, the fallout was severe. Oscar, who had been the one to escalate the violence, was charged with involuntary manslaughter, though his defense argued that he had never meant to harm anyone. Victor, still recovering from his head injury, retreated from the public eye, his once proud intellect now overshadowed by guilt. Samuel, the youngest and perhaps the most emotionally devastated, fell into a deep depression, haunted by the loss of the woman he had idolized and the role he had played in the tragic night. In the end, the three men were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. None of them had intended for things to end this way, but the love they had once felt for Evelyn had turned into a destructive force, leading to a tragic conclusion. The town of Clearwater would never forget the scandal, nor the strange, sorrowful tale of Evelyn Mercer and the men who loved her. For Oscar Victor and Samuel, the consequences of that night would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of how passion, unchecked and unresolved, can lead to unforeseen and devastating outcomes.